My name is May Carter, and on the very night I buried my husband, my daughter-in-law hissed that I should pack my bags and leave while my own son sat silent beside her. I felt the weight of 40 years of marriage and motherhood collapse in that moment, grief twisting into betrayal. But what they never imagined was that Ben had left me a secret $350,000 trust, a gift of love that would one day tear their plan apart. The church smelled faintly of roses and old wood polish, the kind that clung to pews and hymnals long after the service was over. I sat near the front, my black dress stiff against my skin, my fingers clutched around a folded handkerchief that was already damp. Ben's photograph rested on the stand beside the casket, his eyes caught forever in that gentle smile he had whenever he was lost in thought. I tried to focus on the words of the pastor, but they blurred just another echo over the steady roar of grief inside my chest. When the service ended, I felt the weight of dozens of hands on my shoulders, arms pulling me into brief embraces, whispered condolences slipping past me like leaves in the wind. All I could think was how I was supposed to walk out of that church without Ben by my side. For 40 years, he had been the one who steadied me, and now I was supposed to step into the world alone. The cemetery was gray under a low sky. The Pacific breeze carried a chill that cut through my jacket. I stood as they lowered Ben into the ground, my hand trembling around the single white lily I had brought. I let it drop and watched it disappear onto the polished wood. For a moment, I thought I heard his voice steady as ever telling me it would be all right. But then Jay's hand touched my elbow, pulling me back, reminding me that I was here surrounded by mourners, not in some dream where Ben's voice could still reach me. I barely spoke on the ride back. Jay drove his jaw-clenched eyes fixed straight ahead. Sloane scrolled her phone, her manicured nails tapping against the screen, the glow lighting her face in the gray of the car. No one asked if I was all right. No one reached for my hand. I stared out the window at the blur of cypress trees and rooftops, wishing the drive would last forever, wishing I didn't have to walk into a house that would never be the same. Back at the house, the rooms felt hollow, even though people filled them. Distant relatives murmured near the buffet table, neighbors hovered with casseroles and pies, and the scent of coffee drifted through the kitchen. I moved among them like a shadow, thanking them, nodding, listening without hearing. My eyes kept falling to the empty armchair by the window where Ben always read the morning paper. The silence that wrapped around it was unbearable. At one point, a neighbor, Mrs. Walker, touched my hand and whispered that she would pray for me. I forced a smile, my lips barely moving, and thanked her. When she walked away, I sank into a chair in the hallway, staring at the framed photographs on the wall. Ben holding Jay as a newborn, the three of us at Jay's high school graduation, our family vacations to Lake Tahoe. Each picture looked like it belonged to someone else, now a family I no longer recognized. I slipped away into the hallway to breathe, leaning against the wall when I caught the sharp edge of Sloane's voice. She thought she was whispering, but the words carried slicing through the low hum of conversation. Now that he is gone, it is time for her to pack her things and move out. My chest tightened. For a second, I thought I must have misheard. But then Jay's voice followed low and strained, and though I could not make out his words, I heard what mattered most. He was not disagreeing. He was not standing up for me. My knees nearly buckled, and I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. Anger rose hot and quick, but beneath it was something colder, heavier. It was betrayal. I wanted to storm in to shout that this was my house, my life, but grief had left me fragile, my throat too tight for words. I stayed hidden in the shadows, listening as my son's silence sealed my fate. The guests slowly trickled out as evening settled. The house grew quiet except for the clatter of plates in the kitchen where Sloane directed the cleanup. I sat at the edge of the sofa numb, watching Jay carry boxes of leftovers to the counter. His eyes flicked to me once, then away, as if my grief was something inconvenient, something that might spill onto the floor and make a mess he did not want to clean. When the last dish was washed and the last neighbor had hugged me goodbye, the house stood in uneasy silence. Jay and Sloane lingered by the door, coats half buttoned. Jay finally spoke, his tone measured, careful, the way he always was when he knew he was about to hurt me. "Mom, you know this place is too big for you now. It might be time to think about other arrangements." Sloane's eyes glittered with satisfaction as she stepped in, her words sweetened just enough to hide the poison. "We just want what's best for you. Maybe a small condo closer to town. Somewhere easier." My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't find my voice. The living room around me seemed smaller, the walls pressing in. I thought of the nights Ben and I spent repainting those very walls, the dinners we hosted by the fireplace, the mornings I stood at the kitchen sink watching Jay play in the yard. Every memory seemed to rise at once, pressing against me like a tide I couldn't stop. I finally managed to speak, my voice hoarse. "This is my home. Your father built this with me." Jay shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Sloane, then back at me. His silence was heavier than any words he could have chosen. It was agreement, permission for her to continue, and she did, smiling, that tight, satisfied smile. "Things change, May. It will be better for everyone." I stared at them, my throat raw, unable to answer. The room seemed to tilt my world unsteady. Only hours had passed since I laid Ben to rest, and already the walls of the home we had filled with 40 years of memories were being stripped away. I felt the ache spread through me, deeper than grief, sharper than loss. It was betrayal, cold and merciless, from the two people I had trusted most after Ben. I turned away before they could see the tears that gathered, my eyes falling once more on the empty chair by the window. For the first time since the morning, I let myself imagine Ben sitting there watching, and I wished more than anything that he had left me with the strength to face what was coming. The house was finally quiet that night, but it did not feel like peace. It felt like emptiness. I moved from room to room, collecting stray cups and plates, straightening cushions no one had disturbed, wiping down a counter that still smelled of coffee. My hands needed something to do because my heart was too raw, and I knew if I sat still, the grief would consume me. I found myself in Ben's study, touching the spines of books he had read 100 times, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne that lingered in the air. It should have comforted me, but instead it only deepened the hollow ache in my chest. Later, I gathered my black shawl and the condolence cards that people had left on the table, carrying them upstairs to my bedroom. Each step on the staircase seemed heavier than the last. At the landing, I paused, hearing voices float from the kitchen. At first I thought Jay and Sloane were simply discussing the day, but then I caught Sloane's tone sharp and dripping with disdain, and my body froze. I leaned closer, pressing myself against the wall so that their words reached me without them knowing I listened. Sloane's voice cut clear as glass. "I already called Hayes. He'll stop by later this week to look at the place." She paused, her voice lowering but no less venomous. "That woman is just a guest here, eating off what's left. She'll be gone soon." The phrase struck like a slap. Just a guest. Eating off what's left. As though the decades I had spent in this house, the love and labor Ben and I poured into it, meant nothing. As though I had no rightful claim to the walls and windows I had washed and mended with my own hands. I waited for Jay to speak, for him to say something, anything to defend me. All I heard was a sigh, long and weary, and the scrape of a chair. No words of protest, No anger on my behalf. Just silence. His silence was worse than Sloane's cruelty. It told me everything I needed to know about where he stood. I'm my son, my only child. The boy I had raised with tenderness and patience had chosen his wife over his mother. I stumbled back to my room and closed the door, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I sank onto the edge of the bed and pressed my palms to my face, the words circling in my mind. Just a guest, eating off what's left. They echoed louder than the condolences at the church, sharper than the finality of the casket lowering into the ground. For the first time since Ben's passing, my grief shifted. It twisted, reshaped itself into something hot and bitter that spread through my veins. Anger. Anger at Sloane's venom. Anger at Jay's weakness. Anger at myself for ever thinking I was safe in my own family. The next morning, the sun rose pale over Pacific Grove, streaking the sky with tired colors. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, staring out the window at the yard Ben had tended so carefully. The roses looked dry, the grass unkempt, as though they too had stopped thriving when he left. Jay walked in his tie, already knotted briefcase in hand. He nodded toward me but did not sit. "Morning, Mom." His voice carried none of the warmth I once knew. Sloane followed, perfectly pressed in a navy skirt and silk blouse, her perfume filling the room. She glanced at me only briefly before speaking briskly about errands she needed to run. Neither mentioned Hayes, neither mentioned the house. But the knowledge sat between us like a heavy stone, and I could barely force down a sip of coffee. I wanted to ask Jay directly, to demand to know how he could let her speak of me that way, how he could stand by while she plotted to sell the only home I had left. But when I looked at his tired eyes and slumped shoulders, the words lodged in my throat. I was afraid that if I asked, he would answer honestly, and I could not bear to hear it spoken aloud. As the day wore on, I busied myself with small chores, folding laundry that did not need folding, wiping surfaces already clean. Anything to avoid the quiet that pressed against me. In the late afternoon, I carried a basket of linens toward the living room when I heard Sloane again, this time on the phone in the den. Her voice was low, conspiratorial, but clear enough that I could not mistake her words. "Yes, Mr. Hayes, Thursday works." She chuckled, a sound that made my stomach twist. "We need to move quickly. The sooner this is on the market, the sooner we can put all this behind us." Her pause was deliberate, then that cutting phrase again. "She's just staying out of guilt. You know how these people are." I backed away, the linen slipping slightly in my arms, my vision blurring with fresh tears. I wanted to storm in to confront her, to scream that I was not some charity case, not some shadow clinging to scraps. But I did not. I carried the basket upstairs, closed the door behind me, and let the rage burn silently. The betrayal was too raw, my strength too fragile. But inside me, something began to harden. I thought of Ben, of the quiet way he prepared for everything, the hidden plans he never spoke of until the time was right. I clung to that memory like a lifeline, telling myself there had to be something, some piece of him left that could steady me now. That night I lay awake, listening to the creaks of the house, every sound magnified in the dark. I replayed the day in my mind, every slight, every silence. My grief was still there, a steady throb in my chest, but beneath it pulsed something new. A seed planted by Sloane's words, watered by Jay's silence. It was small now, but it would grow. I would see to that, because no one, not even my own son, would erase me from the life I had built. The moonlight spilled through the window and lit the framed photograph on my nightstand. Ben's smile looked softer in that glow, and I whispered to him as though he were still beside me. "I won't let them take this from me. Not your house. not your legacy, not us. The words steadied me not enough to soothe the hurt, but enough to remind me that grief would not drown me. Not anymore. It would forge me into something stronger. When morning came again, I rose with swollen eyes but a spine a little straighter. I moved through the house quietly, listening to the sound of Jay's car pulling away, Sloane's heels clicking across the driveway. Once they were gone, I stood in the middle of the living room, the silence pressing heavy around me. This house was mine, Ben's and mine. And no matter how they whispered or schemed, I would not disappear. Not now, not ever. The phrase echoed again in my mind, bitter but no longer breaking me. Just a guest, eating off what's left. No, I was not a guest. I was the one who had made this place a home, and soon enough they would remember it. I was arranging the roses on the porch when I saw Jay's car roll slowly into the driveway. The way he parked crooked told me something was wrong. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring down at his lap, then finally dragged himself out with the weight of the world on his shoulders. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled as if he had not cared enough to iron it. For a fleeting second, I thought he had come to apologize, to finally acknowledge how deeply he had wounded me. But the moment he stepped into the kitchen, I could tell by the look in his eyes that this visit had a different purpose. He sat down at the table without asking, rubbing his temples with both hands. I poured him coffee out of habit, though my hands trembled, and set the mug in front of him. He took it, but instead of drinking, he stared into it as though it could offer him answers. I waited, my stomach tightening my mind, bracing for what was to come. "Mom," he began, his voice low, hesitant. "I'm in trouble." He looked up finally, and I saw the boy I once knew flicker behind his tired eyes. Not the man who had stood by in silence while his wife stripped me of dignity, but the little boy who once scraped his knee and ran to me for comfort. That memory softened me for a moment until his next words cut through. "I owe the bank $96,000. They've given me 2 weeks before they come after everything." His hands clenched around the mug as though he was holding onto it for dear life. "If I don't pay, we lose everything. Sloane, the kids, me." My heart dropped, but not for the reason he might have hoped. $96,000. I repeated it in my head, stunned by the scale of his debt. Ben and I had lived carefully, saving and planning, never biting off more than we could chew. And here was my son drowning in a sea of recklessness I did not recognize. I asked him quietly how it had happened. His jaw tightened. "Bad investments, some credit cards, a few loans. It spiraled faster than I thought." His voice cracked. "I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to worry you." I leaned back, gripping the edge of the chair to keep myself steady. And now I asked. His eyes finally lifted to mine, and in that moment I saw the truth before he even said it. "We need to sell the house, Mom. It's the only way out. The cottage is worth more than enough. It would cover everything and give us a fresh start." My body went cold. The house. Our house. The cottage Ben had poured his heart into every nail and board, a testament to his love for me, his vision of our retirement together. And now my own son sat in my kitchen asking me to give it away as though it were nothing but a pile of bricks to barter for his mistakes. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That house is all I have left of your father. We built that life together, and I will not see it handed over to a bank. I will not." Jay pushed the mug aside, frustration flashing in his eyes. "Mom, be reasonable. This isn't just about you. This is about family. We could lose everything. Do you want that on your conscience?" His words struck like a knife. He was not pleading anymore. He was pressuring, trying to make me complicit in his downfall. I felt my pulse race, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream that it was not my responsibility to clean up after his failures, that I had already lost too much. Instead, I steadied my voice. "Don't put this on me, Jay. You and Sloan made your choices. You borrowed, you spent. Do not pretend that sacrificing my home will make us a family again." For a moment he looked as though I had slapped him. His eyes darted away, his jaw clenched. He stood pacing the room, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand," he muttered. "They'll come after me. They'll take everything." His voice rose. "You can't keep holding on to the past. The house is just a building. It can save us if you let it." The word save twisted in my chest. He wanted saving, but at the cost of abandoning me, of stripping me of the only sanctuary left. And worse, he spoke of it as if Ben's memory meant nothing. I stood slowly, meeting his gaze. That house is not just a building. It is the life your father and I built together. It is the place where you grew up, where you took your first steps, where every Christmas morning you came down those stairs. If you think I will hand it over because you mismanaged your life, you are wrong." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging. "I thought you'd understand," he said quietly, almost to himself. His eyes met mine again, but they were colder now, harder. "Maybe Sloan was right. Maybe you don't care about what happens to us." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. He left without finishing his coffee, the slam of the door rattling through the house like an aftershock. I stood alone in the kitchen, my hands trembling, the echo of his accusation gnawing at me. I sank into a chair, staring at the empty mug. My chest felt tight, grief and anger colliding inside me. My son was no longer just weak or silent. He had crossed into betrayal, aligning himself fully with the woman who despised me. He was no longer my ally, not even my reluctant protector. He had become part of the problem, part of the force trying to erase me from my own life. That night I walked through the cottage, slowly touching the photographs, the worn banister, the quilt folded neatly at the end of the couch. I whispered to Ben, telling him everything, asking how he would have handled this. No answer came, only the stillness of a house that seemed to hold its breath along with me. The burden was heavy, but in the weight of it I felt something shift inside me. Grief had been my anchor, anger my fuel, but now resolve began to take shape. If Jay thought I would surrender, he was wrong. If Sloan thought she could cut me out, she had underestimated me. I would not be pushed out quietly. Not from this house. Not from the life Ben left me. Not ever. I sat on the porch until the stars came out, the cool Pacific air wrapping around me. For the first time since Ben's death, my tears dried before they could fall. The betrayal of my son had burned away what softness remained. In its place was something steadier, something sharper. They wanted me gone. But I was not going anywhere. Not now. Not with so much on the line. The morning light streamed through the curtains, casting a pale glow across the living room. I had hardly slept, my mind restless after Jay's visit. The house felt both heavy with memories and strangely hollow, without Ben's voice filling the silence. I found myself wandering from room to room, as if retracing his steps would somehow bring him back. Eventually, I stopped in his old study. The scent of cedar lingered in the air, mixed with the faint must of paper that had sat undisturbed too long. I lowered myself into his leather chair, running my fingers over the worn armrest where his hand had rested countless times. The desk was cluttered in the way only Ben could manage, neat to him, but overwhelming to anyone else. Stacks of envelopes, old notebooks, pens that had long run out of ink. I decided to start clearing things both to occupy my hands and to silence the storm in my chest. As I pulled open the lower drawer, I noticed a thick folder wedged tightly in the back. It was labeled in Ben's handwriting, slightly faded but unmistakable. My breath caught when I read the letters HELOC. I pulled it out slowly as though I were handling something fragile. The folder was heavy, stuffed with documents. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. The date at the top was 2021. It was a home equity line of credit. But what struck me wasn't the amount borrowed, but where the money had gone. The record showed $350,000 drawn and transferred directly into a trust. My heart skipped. A trust. I scanned the lines again and again, afraid I had misunderstood. But there it was in black and white. Ben had secured a trust in my name. For a moment, the room blurred, tears welling in my eyes. The thought of him planning this, knowing the battles I might one day face, both broke me and gave me strength. He had left me a shield, something more than memories. My fingers traced his signature at the bottom of the form, bold and steady, as if he were still beside me. I pressed the papers to my chest, whispering his name. You knew, didn't you, Ben? You knew they might try to take everything. A spark lit inside me, faint but real. For weeks I had felt like a pawn trapped and cornered. Now for the first time I glimpsed a move of my own. But the hope was tangled with confusion. I didn't understand all the legal terms, the clauses buried in dense paragraphs. What exactly did this trust protect? Was it still active? Could Jay or Sloan challenge it? I needed answers, but I also needed caution. If they found out before I understood it myself, they would twist it against me. I tucked the folder under my arm and sat back in the chair, staring at the bookshelves that lined the wall. Ben had always been the one to handle finances. I had trusted him completely, sometimes blindly, and now here I was fumbling through paperwork that might be my only salvation. It stung to realize how much I didn't know, how dependent I had been. But it also steeled me. I couldn't rely on anyone else anymore. Not Jay, not Sloan. Only myself. I spread the documents across the desk and studied every page. The numbers made my head ache, the language winding in circles. Still, one thing stood out. The trust had been filed with a law firm in Monterey. A name at the bottom. Attorney William Harper shone like a beacon. I wrote it down carefully, underlining it twice. If anyone could tell me what this meant, it was him. A knock startled me, and I shoved the folder back into the drawer. Jay's voice carried from the hallway, softer than before, but edged with impatience. Mom, are you in there? We need to talk. My pulse raced. If he knew what I was looking at, he would never stop until it was his. I steadied my voice and called out that I was busy, that we would talk later. He hesitated, then walked away. I waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before pulling the folder out again. My fingers traced Ben's signature one more time, and I felt a strange mixture of grief and determination. He had trusted me to carry this through, to hold my ground. The thought both comforted and burdened me. That evening, as the sun sank over the Pacific, I sat on the porch clutching the folder. The waves crashed faintly in the distance, steady and relentless. I thought of Sloane's words echoing in my ears, the venom in her tone when she called me a freeloader. The image of Jay pleading yet demanding, urging me to sell everything. And then I thought of Ben, of the man who had spent his life building not just a home, but a safeguard for me. Hope flickered, but it was fragile, like the first flame on a candle. I knew too little had too few allies. Still, I had something now, something they didn't know about. A secret that could turn the tide if I learned how to use it. I closed the folder, gently holding it as if it were a treasure chest. For the first time since Ben's death, I felt I had a weapon in this battle. I didn't yet know how sharp it was or how to wield it, but it was there waiting. I breathed in the salty air, steadying myself. The fight was far from over. It was only just beginning. The next morning, I was in the kitchen rinsing my coffee cup when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me sharp and uninvited in the stillness of the house. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door to find a tall man in a pressed navy suit standing on the porch. He had a briefcase in one hand, a clipboard in the other, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Mrs. Carter," he said smoothly, his voice practiced. "I'm Mark Hayes. Your son and his wife asked me to stop by. I'm a licensed realtor here in Monterey County." Before I could respond, Sloane appeared behind him, stepping onto the porch like she had orchestrated the whole encounter. She was dressed in a silk blouse, her hair pulled back perfectly, her lips curved in that familiar smile that always hid a sting. "I thought it would be helpful to bring Mark by today," she said lightly, as if she were offering me a favor. "He can give us a sense of what the cottage is worth on the market." My stomach tightened. "She said us, not you." I folded my arms. "I wasn't expecting company. It won't take long," Hayes assured me. He glanced over my shoulder into the living room, his eyes scanning the space as though he already owned it. "I'd just like to take a quick look around. This place has real potential." The words struck me like an insult. Potential, as if the years Ben and I had spent making this house a home were nothing more than a listing to be polished and flipped. I shook my head. "This house isn't for sale." Sloane's smile thinned. "May, let's be reasonable. You know the upkeep here is too much. It's best for everyone if we move forward." "For everyone?" She meant for herself. I looked at Jay, who lingered near the doorway, silent again, his eyes avoiding mine. The betrayal cut deeper each time. Hayes stepped inside without waiting for permission, gesturing with his clipboard. Spacious living room, ocean view from the porch, original hardwood floors. "This will fetch a high price, especially with the market heating up again." He scribbled notes, already reducing my life to bullet points. I followed him reluctantly as he moved from room to room, Sloane trailing behind with feigned enthusiasm. In the dining room, he tapped the oak table Ben had built with his own hands. "Buyers will love this," he said, as if it were a piece in a showroom. In the study, his gaze lingered on the desk where I had just hidden the folder of trust papers. My heart thudded until he moved on. When we returned to the living room, Hayes handed me a sheet clipped to his board. "Just a standard preliminary agreement," he said. "No obligation, but it allows me to begin the process of listing should you decide to sell. All I need is your signature." Sloane leaned close, her voice low but edged. "It really is the best option, May. Think about Jay. Think about the family." My hands trembled, but I kept them at my sides. "I will not sign anything," I said firmly. "This is my home." The air shifted. Hayes's smile faded, replaced with a look of impatience. He glanced at Sloane as though they shared an understanding. Then his eyes met mine, cool and dismissive, as if I were an obstacle in a transaction. He gathered his papers with a sharp snap. "Well, Mrs. Carter," he said, "I'll give you time to reconsider. Houses like this don't sit long once they're listed." They left together, Sloane thanking him with a sweetness that turned my stomach. At the door, she cast one last glance at me, her eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a predator circling prey. When the door closed, silence filled the cottage again, but it was not the silence of peace. It was heavy, suffocating, crawling over my skin. I sank into the armchair and pressed my palms to my knees to steady myself. My own son had stood by while his wife invited a stranger to value my home like merchandise. He had not said a word in my defense. "Ben," I whispered into the emptiness, "what am I supposed to do?" I stared at the folder hidden in the desk drawer, knowing it held more than numbers. It held a chance, a lifeline. Sloane thought she was clever bringing Hayes into our lives as though she had already won. But the trust Ben created could be the wall she never expected. The thought sparked in me like a secret flame. They saw me as weak as a woman with no power. Yet I had something they did not. I could not wield it yet, but I would learn. And when I did, they would realize this home was not theirs to take. That evening I stood on the porch, the ocean breeze cool against my face. The horizon glowed with the last light of day, steady and unyielding. Sloane's words echoed in my head. Hayes's condescension burned in my chest. But beneath the anger was something stronger. Determination. They wanted me gone. They wanted to erase me. But this house, this trust, this life with Ben was not theirs to rewrite. Not while I still drew breath. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the waves steady me. Tomorrow I would begin to understand the documents. Tomorrow I would find the strength to fight back. Tonight I let the anger harden into resolve. The morning after Hayes had walked through my home with his clipboard, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder I had hidden in the desk. My coffee had gone cold, but I stared at the pages as if they might come alive and tell me what to do. The words were heavy with legal language terms I could barely follow, but one name kept appearing: Margot Lee. I remembered Margot well. She had been Ben's friend since college, a steady woman who had worked as an accountant in town for decades. If anyone could explain this, it would be her. I called her office and asked if she had time to see me. Her voice on the other end was calm, welcoming, and when she heard Ben's name, it softened even more. "Come in this afternoon, May," she said. "Bring whatever you have." The drive into town felt long, though it was only 15 minutes. Pacific Grove stretched out with its quiet streets and the salt air blowing through the open window of my car. I clutched the folder on the passenger seat as if it were a lifeline. When I reached Margot's office above the small strip of shops near Lighthouse Avenue, I hesitated before pushing open the door. She met me with a warm hug, her short gray hair framing a face that still carried the steadiness I remembered. "I'm so sorry about Ben," she said softly. "He was one of the good ones." I swallowed hard, then handed her the folder. "I don't know what this means, Margot, but I think Ben left me something here, something important." She led me to a chair across from her desk and began spreading out the papers. Her reading glasses slid down her nose as she examined each page carefully. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the rustle of paper. Finally, she looked up at me, her expression shifting to something serious. "May," she said slowly, "these papers show that in 2021, Ben took out a home equity line of credit for $350,000. But here's the important part. He placed that money into a trust." A trust. The words sounded like a locked door and a key at the same time. "What does that mean for me?" "It means this money is outside of probate. It is not tied up with the estate in the usual way, and because it is in a trust, Jay and Sloane cannot touch it, not unless you give them permission." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "But if they push you into selling the house before all this is resolved, you could lose your protection." I felt my pulse in my throat. "So Ben, he planned this?" She nodded. "He must have known things might turn difficult. He set this up as a shield for you. But May, you need to be careful. These kinds of trusts can be tricky, and if Sloane is already talking to realtors, then she is moving fast." I leaned back, the chair creaking under me. "Sloane thinks I am weak," I whispered. She thinks she can walk in and erase me. Margot folded her hands on the desk. You are not weak, but you need an attorney, someone who knows how to enforce what Ben set up. Otherwise, they will outmaneuver you, and once the house is sold, it's gone. The weight of her warning sank deep. I remembered Hayes's cold eyes, Sloane's smirk, Jay's silence. They weren't waiting. They were pushing every day. Do you know anyone, I asked? Someone I can trust? Margot nodded. I'll give you the name of a lawyer I've worked with. She specializes in estate and trust law. She can explain what you need to do and make sure you are protected. I pressed my hands together, trying to stop the trembling. Thank you, Margot. I don't know what I would have done without you. She reached across the desk, squeezing my fingers. Ben always said you were stronger than you believed. This trust is his way of reminding you of that. When I left her office, the late afternoon sun was slanting across the street, casting long shadows. I walked slowly to my car, the folder clutched tightly in my arms, as if Ben himself had placed it there. The words replayed in my mind. $350,000. A trust. Beyond their reach. I drove home with the windows down, the sea breeze filling the car. My grief was still there, raw and aching, but it had shifted into something sharper. Determination. They had underestimated me, but Ben had not. He had prepared. Back at the cottage, I placed the folder back into the drawer, carefully sliding it beneath the stack of old photo albums. I touched the wood of the desk, feeling the grooves where Ben's hands had worked. You knew, didn't you? I whispered. You knew they would turn on me. I sat at the desk for a long while, the house quiet except for the ticking of the clock in the hall. I could hear the faint crash of waves outside, steady and relentless, just like I needed to be. The fear of losing everything still lingered, but for the first time since the funeral, I had something solid under my feet. Margot's words gave me direction. The trust was the key. Now I had to find the right hands to help me use it. That night, as the lamps cast soft light across the living room, I stared at the doorway where Hayes had stood, clipboard in hand, eyes full of judgment. I thought of Sloane's voice dripping with false kindness as she urged me to sign. And I thought of Jay, silent and complicit, my son, who once clung to my hand as a boy. They wanted me out. But I was not leaving. I folded my arms across my chest, steadying my breath. Tomorrow I would call the lawyer Margot recommended. Tomorrow I would take the first step in protecting what Ben had left. Tonight, I let myself rest with the knowledge that I was not entirely defenseless. The trust was real. And now so was my resolve. I called Jay one evening, my voice steady though my chest was tight with dread. I asked him to meet me somewhere quiet, away from Sloane's shadow. He agreed with hesitation, his tone clipped and cold, as though even this small request was a burden. We settled on a modest diner just outside Pacific Grove, the kind of place that had not changed in decades, where the booths were cracked vinyl and the coffee came strong and endless. I chose it because it was where I used to take him after his baseball games when he was still a boy with dirt on his knees and dreams in his eyes. He was already there when I walked in, hunched over a chipped mug of coffee, his back rigid. He did not stand to greet me. I slid into the booth across from him, my palms damp. The fluorescent light overhead made the lines on his face look harsher, as though years had aged him overnight. Jay? I began softly. I needed to see you without anyone else around. He lifted his eyes, cold and weary. I know, Mom. You want to talk me out of this. I reached for memories for the bond I thought we still shared. Do you remember those mornings I drove you to practice before dawn, or the nights I stayed awake with you when you were sick, counting the hours until your fever broke? Your father and I gave you everything we had, not for us, but for you. His expression did not soften. Mom, this isn't about the past. This is about now. You keep trying to pull on my guilt, but guilt doesn't pay bills. I have a wife, kids, a mortgage. I cannot keep drowning. The words cut deep. I searched his face, but it was like staring at a stranger. I buried your father less than a month ago. And now I feel like I'm burying you too, I said, my voice cracking. He set the mug down with a sharp clink. You just don't get it. We are trapped under debt. $96,000. The bank has given me 2 weeks, Mom. Selling that house is the only option that makes sense. I froze. So that was it. His desperation was real, but instead of looking for another path, he had turned toward mine like a predator circling prey. The house was not just bricks and wood. It was the life Ben and I built. It was the laughter of Christmas mornings, the quiet evenings on the porch, the sound of Jay's little feet running through the hallway. This house is your father's legacy, I whispered. It is not a lifeline for your mistakes. He looked away toward the window smeared with condensation. Maybe Dad was willing to let sentiment cloud his judgment. But I can't. I have to think of my family's future. The way he said family lodged like glass in my chest. I was not included in it. I was outside the circle, cut off like an unwanted guest. I pressed on, desperate. I am your mother. I am still part of your family. If you and Sloan push me out, what does that make you? His jaw tightened, his silence louder than any words. I leaned forward, whispering, Sloan speaks, and you echo her. Are you truly making choices for yourself, or just following her lead? His head snapped back toward me, his eyes flashing. Don't bring Sloan into this. She is my wife. She's the one who has stood by me while everything fell apart, and I wasn't there for you. I shot back, my voice trembling. Who nursed you when you broke your arm at 10? Who sat through every school meeting, every disappointment, every heartbreak? I have stood by you since the day you were born. He rubbed his face, exhausted. Mom, this is not about love. It's about survival. The math doesn't care about feelings. I felt the weight of the betrayal press down on me, heavier than grief ever had. I had lost Ben, and now I was losing Jay. Not because death took him, but because he willingly chose to walk away from me. When I rose from the booth, my legs trembled, but I held myself upright. If you cannot stand with me, then you are standing against me. He didn't look up. He stared at the table as if the crumbs of pie crust held more meaning than his own mother's words. I walked out of the diner into the cold night. The air smelled of salt from the ocean, sharp and stinging. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I drove back to the cottage, the headlights carving tunnels of light through the fog. Every mile felt like another inch of distance between me and the son I once knew. When I pulled into the driveway, the windows glowed warmly, shadows moving inside. I sat in the car for a long time, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. My reflection in the rearview mirror showed a woman both broken and burning. Inside, I moved slowly, each step heavy. The walls of the house felt closer than ever, pressing in with the weight of history. I brushed my fingers along the photographs that still lined the hallway. Jay at 6 holding his first baseball glove. Jay at 18, cap and gown, smiling with pride. Ben beside him, eyes wet with joy. My chest tightened at the memory of who he used to be. I realized then that I was standing at the edge of a battlefield I never wanted. It was no longer just Sloan's ambition I had to fight. It was my own child's betrayal, and knowing that truth carved deeper wounds than any stranger ever could. Yet beneath the ache, a spark lit inside me. Ben had trusted me enough to build that trust, to leave behind a safeguard they could not touch. My son's betrayal would not erase the strength my husband had passed on to me. The road ahead would be brutal, but I could not shrink from it. I had already lost my husband. I could not allow them to take my home, my dignity, and my place in this world. As I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, the sound of the ocean drifted faintly through the window, steady and relentless. I lay there staring at the ceiling, knowing that from this moment forward, I was not just a grieving widow. I was a woman preparing for war. The afternoon light slanted across the living room, painting long shadows over the worn carpet as I sat alone in silence. The air felt thick with betrayal, and even the sound of the waves from the Pacific outside the cottage could not quiet the storm in my chest. I wanted to believe that Jay was only misguided, that the son I had raised with every ounce of love had been twisted by Sloane's sharp tongue and relentless ambition. But the truth was clearer with each passing day. His silence was not ignorance, it was consent. 2 mornings later, I received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was Tom Rivera, Ben's old project manager, a man I had known for decades. His tone was hesitant but urgent. "May, it's Tom. Can we meet? It's important and not something I can say over the phone." We arranged to meet at the marina in Monterey, a place where Ben used to walk with Tom after long days at the construction site. I drove there with my hands clenched on the steering wheel, every nerve taut. Tom was waiting near the dock, his weathered face drawn and uneasy. He greeted me with a handshake that lingered longer than usual, as though the weight he carried needed steadying. "May, I wouldn't involve you if it weren't serious. Jay and Sloane came to see me." My stomach dropped. "What did they want from you?" "They wanted me to sign off on documents inflating the value of Carter Construction's old assets. Trucks, equipment, property, all marked up like they were brand new. They wanted me to put my name on it so they could use it as collateral." His jaw tightened. "I told them no." I closed my eyes for a moment, grief sharpening into something harder. And what did they say? Sloane tried to sweet-talk me, told me it was just paperwork that no one would ever check. Jay just sat there, eyes on the table. He didn't say a word, but he didn't stop her either. I felt my throat constrict, the ache of betrayal spreading deeper. So he's letting her lead him down this path. Tom leaned closer, lowering his voice. Before Ben passed, he told me something. He said, "If May ever faces trouble, remind her to guard the trust." He made me promise I'd never forget. That trust is her protection. My breath caught. He said that. I swear he did. He wanted to make sure you were safe if anyone tried to strip you of what was yours. That's why I had to tell you. They're desperate, May. And desperate people do reckless things. Tears pricked my eyes, but I swallowed them back. Thank you, Tom. You don't know how much this means. We parted quietly, both aware that even our meeting might stir suspicion if Sloane caught wind of it. Driving home, I replayed Tom's words again and again, each repetition like a thread stitching armor around my heart. When I arrived, the cottage looked the same, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a fortress under siege. Later that evening, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. Jay and Sloane stepped out of their SUV, and even from the window, I could see the determined set of her shoulders. She was carrying a folder. Jay trailed behind her like a man already defeated. I opened the door before they could knock. Mom Sloane began her smile wide and false. "We just came by to make things easier for everyone. Hayes wants to finalize some paperwork, and if we all work together, this will go smoothly." I studied her, then looked at Jay. His eyes slid away from mine. "Smooth for you, maybe." "Not for me," I said flatly. Sloane's smile tightened. "You don't want this dragged out, do you?" "It's better to move forward." Jay finally spoke, his voice subdued. Mom, please, don't make this harder than it has to be. The anger that had been simmering for weeks broke through, but I kept my voice steady. Harder. You already went to Tom Rivera and tried to force him into fraud. Do you think I wouldn't find out? Sloane froze, her mask cracking, while Jay's head snapped up in shock. I pressed on my words sharp as a blade. I will not sign anything. I will not let you sell this house as if it's just another asset to trade away. Your father built this life, and I won't see it destroyed for your schemes. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Sloane's eyes narrowed, the charm gone from her face. Jay's cheeks flushed red, but no defense came from his lips. Finally, I stepped aside and pointed to the door. This is my home. Leave. They hesitated, then walked out stiffly. The slam of the door reverberated through the cottage like thunder, shaking the frames on the walls. I sank into Ben's old chair at the desk, pulling the trust papers toward me. My fingers brushed over his signature, steady and sure, as if he had left a piece of his strength in the ink. For the first time since the funeral, I felt his presence not as a memory of loss, but as a shield against the storm. The battle was far from over, but I knew now that I was not as powerless as they wanted me to believe. With Tom's warning and Ben's trust in my hands, I was ready to face them no matter how relentless their pressure became. The morning air carried a damp chill as I sat at the kitchen table with the stack of papers spread before me. The trust documents, the HELOC file, Ben's careful notes, all of it lay under my hands like a quiet lifeline. I knew now that I could not waste another day hoping Jay would come to his senses or that Sloane would show restraint. They were circling like vultures, and if I waited, I would lose everything. I picked up the phone and dialed the number I had been turning over in my mind for days. James Hall had been our family's attorney for nearly 3 decades, a man Ben trusted through every business deal and every property purchase. His voice, steady and calm, came through the receiver. May, it's been too long. I'm so sorry about Ben. I meant to reach out sooner. Thank you, James. I managed, my throat tightening. I need your help. It's about the house, the trust, everything Ben left behind. His tone sharpened with focus. Bring me the documents. Come to my office this afternoon. By noon, I was sitting in a leather chair across from him, the walls lined with framed certificates and shelves of thick law books. He adjusted his glasses as I slid the folder across the desk. His fingers were methodical as he unfolded each page, scanning the signatures, the dates, the notarizations. After several long minutes, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. May, this is solid. The trust is valid, properly executed, and fully funded with the HELOC proceeds. Ben made you the successor trustee. That means you have sole authority to manage these assets. Relief flooded me, but so did disbelief. So, Sloane and Jay, they have no right to sell anything. None. James confirmed firmly. Unless you authorize it, their hands are tied. That cottage, the trust funds, everything Ben placed under your name is yours to manage. If they've been pressuring you, it has no legal ground. I closed my eyes for a moment, the weight of his words pressing against the ache I had carried for weeks. It was the first time I felt like I wasn't standing alone in a storm. James leaned forward, his voice quieter but resolute. I'll draft a formal statement confirming your authority. We can file it with the county clerk to ensure any attempted sale is blocked. And if they try to force your hand, I will step in. Tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. Ben prepared this. He must have known they would try to take everything from me. James's expression softened. He knew the character of people, May, and he trusted you to protect what he built. Now it's time you let the law protect you. I nodded, my resolve hardening. Thank you, James. Truly. He gathered the documents and began drafting paperwork with practiced precision. The sound of his pen scratching across the page felt like armor being forged. When he finished, he slid a copy toward me. "Keep this with you. If Hayes or anyone else comes to push a sale, show them this. If they don't back down, call me immediately." I folded the papers carefully into my purse, feeling their weight like a weapon I had finally learned to wield. Driving back to Pacific Grove, I kept glancing at the ocean to steady myself. The trust wasn't just ink and signatures anymore. It was my shield, my proof that I was not a helpless widow to be bullied out of her home. When I pulled into the driveway, Sloane's car was already there. My chest tightened, but I held my purse tighter. Inside, she was standing near the window with Hayes flipping through glossy brochures of properties, her voice bright with false excitement. "Oh, May, we were just thinking ahead," she said sweetly. "Hayes believes now is the best time to list." I set my purse on the table and pulled out the folded statement James had given me. I placed it on the counter between us. "This is from my attorney. The trust makes me the sole trustee. You have no right to sell, no right to even suggest it." Her smile, faltered eyes flicking to Hayes. He reached for the document, scanning it quickly before clearing his throat. "Mrs. Carter, if this is true, then I have no business here." Sloane's cheeks flushed, but she pressed on her tone sharp. "You don't want a war with your own family, May." I looked at her steadily. "I didn't start this war, but I will finish it if I have to." Hayes excused himself quickly, muttering something about needing to get back to his office. The slam of the front door left only silence and the faint ticking of the old wall clock. Sloane stared at me, her eyes cold. "You're making a mistake." I folded the paper again, sliding it back into my purse. "No," I said quietly. "For once I'm not." She turned on her heel and stormed out, her heels striking hard against the wood floor. The cottage settled into quiet again, but this time it was not the quiet of fear. It was the quiet of a battlefield where the first line had finally been drawn. I sat down slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. I was not done fighting, but now I was no longer fighting empty-handed. With the law on my side, I finally had something that Jay and Sloane could not twist or erase, and for the first time, I felt that the tide was beginning to turn. The morning air was heavy with the smell of fresh paint and lemon polish, an effort Sloane had clearly made to prepare the house for what she imagined would be its grand unveiling. I heard laughter downstairs, the clinking of glasses, and then the low drone of an unfamiliar man's voice. I held the strap of my purse tightly, the weight of the trust papers resting against my side, and made my way down the staircase with deliberate steps. From the hallway, I could already see them gathered in the living room. Sloane sat like a queen on the sofa, her hair done perfectly, a glass of wine balanced between her fingers, though it was not even noon. Jay stood stiffly behind her shoulders, tense, as if he were trying to appear in control. Hayes, the realtor, leaned casually over the coffee table, his folder spread open, while across from him a couple in their 40s nodded with polite interest. They looked like they were already picturing their furniture against my walls, their children running across my floors. Sloane's smile widened when she saw me, though her eyes were sharp. "Well, May, look who decided to join us. You're just in time to hear the good news. These wonderful people are very interested in the house. We're moving forward quickly." I stepped into the room, feeling the tension tighten around my chest, but letting my voice remain steady. "That is interesting, considering none of you has the authority to sell this property." Hayes straightened, his professional tone slipping as he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carter, I was told this property belonged to your son and his wife. It belonged to my husband," I said firmly, moving to the table. "And before he died, he placed it into a trust." I pulled the thick envelope from my purse and spread the documents across the table. The signatures gleamed under the light. I am the successor trustee. This house cannot be sold without my consent. The couple leaned closer, their smiles fading. The husband frowned, tapping the page with his finger. This is notarized. Sloane's voice cracked as she tried to regain control. Those papers are old irrelevant. Ben never meant for it to be this way. I kept my eyes on her. Ben meant exactly this. He wanted to ensure I was protected, that no one could take this house from me. The door opened at that moment, and James Hall stepped in his presence, filling the room with quiet authority. Good morning. I am Mrs. Carter's attorney. Everything she has presented here is valid. The trust is legal, binding, and enforceable. Any attempt to proceed with a sale would not only fail, but could result in serious legal consequences. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Jay's face turned pale, his eyes darting from me to Sloane. The couple across from us rose quietly, the woman tugging at her husband's sleeve. We clearly misunderstood the situation. This is not what we were led to believe. Hayes closed his folder with a snap, his face drained of its salesman charm. My apologies, Mrs. Carter. I was misinformed. I will withdraw immediately. Without another glance at Jay or Sloane, he hurried out, the couple close behind him. The front door clicked shut, leaving only the three of us and James in the room. Sloane set her wine glass down with a sharp clink, her hand trembling though she tried to mask it. You had this planned, didn't you? Waiting for the perfect moment to humiliate us. I looked at her without flinching. I did not have to plan anything. Ben did that for me. He trusted me to protect his legacy, and I will honor that. Jay finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain. Mom. I thought I cut him off with a raised hand. No. You didn't think. You stood there and let her treat me like an intruder in my own home. You chose silence when she called me a burden. You let her lead you down this path, and now you see where it ends. James placed a steady hand on my shoulder. The law is clear. You hold all authority. They cannot touch this house. Sloane's face darkened, her lips pressed into a thin line. You may think you've won today, but this isn't over. I leaned forward, my voice calm but edged with steel. For me it is. This house will remain mine. You will find another way to solve your problems, but it will not be at my expense. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner, each sound punctuating the silence that followed. Jay lowered his gaze, shame etched into his features, but I felt no urge to comfort him. That part of me, the mother who always softened, had been chipped away. I gathered the trust documents and returned them to my purse. Then I stood, my shoulders squared, feeling the weight of weeks of grief and doubt lift just slightly. I had been underestimated, dismissed, shoved aside like I didn't matter. But now the truth had been spoken aloud, witnessed, confirmed by the law itself. I turned toward the stairs, each step deliberate, not rushing, not faltering. Behind me I could feel their eyes burning, but they did not speak. The silence itself was victory for now. I paused halfway up the staircase, looking briefly at the family photos on the wall, images of years when Jay was still a boy, when the laughter in this house was genuine, when Ben's hand rested steady on my shoulder. The contrast to the moment I had just left was almost too much to bear, yet it hardened me further. When I reached the top of the stairs, I closed my bedroom door, gently shutting out their voices, shutting out the bitterness for the moment. I sat on the edge of my bed, the envelope beside me, and let the silence of the room seep into my bones. The battle wasn't finished. But today, for the first time since Ben's funeral, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt the certainty that I was not powerless, and that was enough to carry me into what was still to come. The following week, The first letter from the bank arrived in a stiff white envelope with bold print across the top. I saw Jay standing on the porch reading it, his face drained of color, the paper trembling in his hands. From the window, I caught the faint sound of his muttering a curse carried off by the sea breeze. He crumpled the letter, then smoothed it again as if the words might change if he looked long enough. I did not ask what it said. I knew. The debt he tried to bury was now clawing its way into daylight, the bank giving him notice the countdown to repossession already set. Days later, another letter came, then a phone call. I heard his voice low and frantic in the kitchen, pleading with someone on the other end, promising payments he could not make. Sloane stormed through the house after her heels striking the floor like angry drums, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You told me we had more time. You said it was handled." Jay tried to soothe her, but his words carried no strength. Their whispers rose into shouts, then fell again into the uneasy silence of two people cornered with no way out. It did not stop there. By the end of the month, neighbors began to whisper. Small towns like Pacific Grove carried secrets poorly, and soon everyone knew Jay owed more than he could ever repay. People exchanged looks at the grocery store. Voices dropped when they passed Sloane in the post office. I watched it unfold from my porch. Across the street, Mrs. Langford leaned on her fence, shaking her head as Sloane hurried to her car, sunglasses hiding her eyes. Two men outside the coffee shop muttered as Jay walked past one of them, saying too loudly, "I thought he had it made." Then came the blow Sloane never expected. Word spread in the realtor circles, her name carried with it a stain she could not scrub away. Hayes had spoken, others confirmed. She was branded reckless, unethical, a liability no client wanted. Contracts vanished overnight. Listings pulled back. One by one, doors that once opened easily slammed in her face. I heard her slam our front door one evening, her arms full of papers she tossed onto the floor. "They think they can do this to me, after everything I've done." Jay bent to gather the papers, his hands clumsy, but she shoved him away. "You ruined this, Jay. You ruined us." Her voice cracked under the weight of her own fury. I stood quietly in the hallway, unseen, listening. For the first time, there was no arrogance in her tone, only panic. At church the following Sunday, heads turned. I could feel the pitying eyes, the sympathetic murmurs meant for me, not them. Mrs. Green touched my arm softly, whispering, "I'm so sorry about your boy. The choices he made. It must be hard." I nodded, unable to say more. Hard was not the word. It was like watching someone drown while they kicked away every hand that reached to save them. One afternoon, Tom Rivera came by, his face grim. He told me quietly that Sloane had tried to corner him again, pushing him to sign off on more papers to create value where there was none. He refused. She shouted at him in the parking lot of his office, loud enough for his staff to hear. "She's desperate, May, but I'm not going to help her destroy herself." The news traveled fast. By the end of the week, her outburst was the story on every porch in every shop. The image she crafted so carefully collapsed like wet cardboard. I wish I could say I felt triumph, but sitting alone in the evening light, I felt only a heavy ache. The house was quiet, except for the creak of the old beams, the same sounds that once comforted me when Ben was alive. My heart ached for the boy I raised, the child who once laughed in these rooms. I pressed my hand against the frame of a photograph on the mantel, Jay's smile wide, his arms slung around me, a memory frozen before betrayal and debt and Sloane. But life has its own way of balancing scales. I had not lifted a finger against them. Their ruin came from the very seeds they planted themselves. the bank pressed harder, threatening legal action, and the whispers in town grew louder, sharper, until Sloane barely showed her face. That evening, I stepped out onto the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. The air smelled of salt and pine. Across the street, lights flickered on in the Langford house, the sound of children's laughter carrying across the road. My own house, though quiet, felt solid, safe. Ben's trust had protected me, shielded what mattered most. I lowered myself into the rocking chair and let the silence settle around me. Somewhere inside, I still wished Jay had chosen differently, that he had remembered who stood by him first, who gave him everything. But fate had delivered its own answer, and I no longer had to fight to make it so. Justice, it seemed, did not always require my hand. Sometimes it came on its own, swift and undeniable, leaving me with nothing but the sound of the waves in the distance and the weight of a bittersweet peace. The morning light spilled across the ocean, soft and golden, as I sat at the kitchen table of the house Ben and I built our life in. The waves outside sounded steady, like a heartbeat, reminding me that some things remain constant even when everything else falls apart. The papers from the trust rested neatly in a drawer, untouched for days, yet their presence gave me strength. It was not just money, not just a legal shield. It was Ben's last act of love, his way of saying he had thought of me even when he knew he might not be here to stand beside me. The number itself, $350,000, could have been just ink on paper, but to me it meant security, dignity, a chance to live without fear of being cast out of my own home. I often imagined Ben sitting at the same table, pen in hand, determined to set everything in place so I would never be left defenseless. That thought carried me through the loneliest nights. With the house safe, I began to breathe differently, deeper, without the constant weight pressing on my chest. The walls no longer felt like a battlefield, but like a sanctuary again. I opened the curtains wide, let the sun pour in, and even placed fresh flowers in the vase by the window, something I had not done since the funeral. Still, silence is heavy when it lingers too long. One afternoon, Linda Brooks, a neighbor who had walked her own path of grief, invited me to a small gathering at the community center. It was a group of widows' women who had loved deeply and lost, each carrying her own story. I hesitated at first, unsure if I belonged, but something inside urged me to go. The circle was gentle. There were no demands, only listening ears and kind faces. Linda shared about the day her husband passed, and how she spent weeks wandering the house at night, afraid to lie down in their bed alone. Another woman spoke about trying to fix the leaky faucet herself, breaking down in tears when the water splashed everywhere because it reminded her of the little things her husband always took care of. As they spoke, I realized I was not as alone as I thought. When my turn came, my voice shook, but I told them about the trust, about how Ben had quietly left me this shield, how his foresight had saved me from being erased in my own home. The women nodded, some with tears, others with soft smiles. One said quietly that it sounded like love carried beyond death. I held on to that thought. Week by week, I returned to the group. We shared coffee, laughter, and even silence that felt less empty because it was shared. Slowly, I found myself looking forward to those afternoons, to the companionship that asked for nothing more than honesty. Linda became a true friend, often stopping by with a pie or a newspaper, sitting with me on the porch as the ocean breeze tangled our hair. Life did not turn perfect. The ache of betrayal from Jay still lived inside me, a wound not easily healed. Yet time and distance brought perspective. I no longer felt consumed by anger. Instead, there was a quiet sorrow mixed with acceptance. My son had made his choices, and consequences had followed him swiftly. I prayed one day he might find his way back, not for me, but for himself. Until then, I carried on. The trust allowed me to keep the house, to maintain it, to live with dignity, but more than that, it reminded me daily that I was not powerless. I thought often of Sloane's words, sharp and cruel, telling me to pack my bags, to leave, to vanish. Yet here I was, still standing in the very home she tried to claim, still rocking in the chair Ben once sat in, still breathing the salt air he loved. Her voice had no power now. One evening as the sun dipped low, Linda and I walked along the shore. She said gently that grief never disappears, but it softens like the tide smoothing sharp rocks into sand. I knew she was right. Each wave that rolled in carried both memory and release. I have learned something through all of this. No one has the right to erase you from your own life. Not a daughter-in-law, not even a misguided son, not the weight of grief. You have to speak, to stand, to hold on to what is yours. Sometimes, as I discovered, justice has already been prepared, waiting quietly until the moment it is needed. So I sit tonight in my home, the lamps glowing warm against the dark, the ocean steady beyond the windows. Ben's gift protects me still, but it is more than money or legal papers. It is love enduring and unshakable, carrying me forward. And to you listening to my story, I will say this: do not let anyone silence you. Do not let anyone tell you that you do not belong. Raise your voice, because the truth may already be on your side, waiting just as mine was. Stay with me, share your thoughts, and let's keep these stories alive together, because sometimes the justice we hope for has already been written into our lives, if only we are brave enough to claim it.